So let's talk specifically about improving output, right? Then what can we do to make output better? Well, number one is real communication. That's sort of the blanket answer, because within real communication, you are forced to practice recall. You are forced to have pronunciation that is accurate enough that it's understandable.
Mm-hmm.
You are forced to be able to connect words and sentences at the correct speed. I need the practice, and I'm not going to get better at that point by input alone. I need recall practice. I need pronunciation practice. I need that fluency practice of being forced in a situation to produce the words and the ideas right there for the means of communicating my need.
Hi, Carp.
Hello, Alvaro. And it's good to be here today. Thank you for inviting me, of course.
It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yes. Yeah.
And well, first of all, as usual, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your background, your language background, and anything you think is relevant?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, my journey with a second language or a different language other than my native English started when I was, I guess, 14, because that's when I started high school, and that was when I started taking Spanish. So that's very common in the U.S. that most people don't start until then, and then they, take something like 2 years of a language in high school, and then maybe 1 or 2 more semesters in college, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And so my journey started way back then, and very much as it has changed a lot, the norm for how language is taught in high school in the U.S., but there's still a lot of people using a traditional grammar or grammar translation approach. And so I learned that same way. Sit in the class, here's a worksheet, here are verb conjugation charts, so many verb charts. It was all just worksheets or pages taken straight out of a workbook or a textbook, and that's most of what I did for my first 2 years of high school. What changed everything for me is after my second year of high school, we were given an opportunity to travel abroad on a short trip as a group. And so it was me, and I think there were only maybe 6 or 7 students total. It wasn't that many people, which is good, honestly. So we had a small group, our Spanish teacher, and another teacher from the district. And we went to Guatemala.
Oh, nice.
And especially, not even just on the language side, but me being an individual who's grown up in central United States, in the Midwest, it is so important for us, people like me who have grown up here, to get out into the world and see what else there is. Because especially being from the USA, it is very easy to feel like nothing else exists or nothing else matters, right? It's so easy to forget about other people's problems if you don't bother to take a look around. And so that first trip to Guatemala changed a lot for me. It changed the way I look at the world, the way I understand, even the way I understood things like happiness changed, within a few days, because you see how other people are living, what things they have that you don't, what things you have that they don't. I mean, the change in the learning there is profound, and I think is necessary if you expect to be a global citizen or a good human in the modern age. You need to have an experience like that, and the more the better. So I had that experience to Guatemala, and the whole time we were there, we took language classes almost every single day. So instead of just, having learned in a classroom, now I was still in a language-focused setting, but it wasn't just, writing sentences. It wasn't verb charts. We would do things like we would just chat with our teacher, or we would go as a group with our teachers, because we all had one-on-one classes there. we would go as a group with our teachers and we would all go to the market together and, shop and talk about what was happening. Or we would play board games,
Nice.
visit the city, right? And so all of a sudden you have what is very real language learning and very real language practice, which of course took all these pieces of language that were sort of floating in my head that didn't really connect, and things started clicking really fast. And, now it's not very surprising because you realize, that was just those were all communication opportunities. And that's what we need, right? You need genuine communication, because all of a sudden the things I was talking about weren't just important for me to get a good grade on a worksheet. Now it was about what I actually wanted that was right there in front of me, or what my friends were looking for. Everything was real, right?
Communication. Right.
That's it. So from that moment on, I knew, okay, I really love this. It feels great. It's fascinating. And I feel there's so much more for me to discover. So I already knew I was going to continue with Spanish. So I finished out high school and took 2 more years of Spanish. And I didn't just take the Spanish class. Another thing that I did, and I made a YouTube short on this a couple months ago, I think. Another thing that I did while I was in high school is that I didn't feel like, my 50 minutes of Spanish every day was enough. Mm-hmm. So I found ways to practice outside, and the easiest way for me to do that was with online video games. So I convinced my mom to buy me a subscription to this game for a year, and I would get online and I would create lobbies or create rooms and just say like Hispanohablantes or something as the title of the name, and I would get a bunch of Spanish speakers, right? And then I would just practice talking with them, and that let me continue to communicate in a virtual but in a real way. It was still real communication because we had things we were trying to do in the game or be learning about one another. It was amazing. So that carried me through high school, and I knew I wanted to be a language teacher when I was starting college, but I also knew that I wanted to be able to find a job as easily as possible. And someone from my school district said, if you can teach more than one subject, a lot of people will want to hire you. Mm. And so I thought, okay, I'll learn French. And so I started college and started learning French. And French was, my major with education, with secondary education. And so I more or less stopped taking formal Spanish classes at that point and got my practice elsewhere, and I focused on French. So I took French all through college. I had a study opportunity in Cannes in southern France. Yeah. Beautiful place, pretty expensive, but beautiful.
I was going to say.
Right. And then I had another study opportunity in Angers. So that's how I learned all my French through college. And those abroad experiences, I had a chance to visit Spain for about 10 days while I was on one of those trips. And then I got back and, finished school, got a job and all that stuff. But of course, I wasn't done learning languages. So a friend of mine, her husband is half Italian. His dad is Italian and his mom is American. So he speaks Italian, and they were going to get married and start their life together and all that. So she said, well, I want to learn Italian so that I can talk with my husband and his family more. And I said, okay, let's learn Italian together. And so we didn't have a teacher. And this was the first time that I started trying to learn a language with no teacher, right? Just using resources, reading things, trying to pick it up. And of course, that changes how you look at things when you don't have an expert or a teacher there. And I did that for, a year and a half or so. We spent a lot of time studying together. And then at some point, I had a new idea. And that was, I've been learning, after I started teaching with my school district for a couple of years, I had been learning a lot more about comprehensible input and about TPRS, about communicative language learning and all those things. And I really wanted to experience it for myself because I can try to teach using those principles. But I never learned using those principles. So I felt there's part of this experience that I cannot understand because I was never in the position to learn in that way.
Right.
And I
was actually going to ask you, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, go ahead.
Like, how do you come in contact with, or how do you come across comprehensible input if you didn't get to learn about it in college, right?
Correct. I did not learn about it in college. I had a great language learning methods teacher in college, a very smart guy, Dr. Cordova, and he was awesome. But, and he had ideas, I think, that were bridging into the direction that second language acquisition is going now and has been for several years, but maybe they weren't labeled as they are now, right? But all the same, we didn't really talk about comprehensible input. If anything, I think his focus was truly on task-based learning and communicative learning, which is great.
Yep.
But we never touched that term, comprehensible input. So after a couple years teaching French in the school district where I taught, we were offered to go to a workshop on comprehensible input, led by Tina Hargadin.
Okay.
So I went to that. That was my baptism into comprehensible input. And I thought, wow, this is so cool. And I took everything. That workshop was in the summer, not during the school year, right? And I took all that and I said, I'm starting to implement these methods. Not everything, but I'm going to take as much as I can and put it to work this year as soon as I can because I believe in it.
Yep.
And it was a couple years later that I had this feeling with Japanese, like, I'm going to learn Japanese and I'm going to trust the claims or the theories of comprehensible input and see how it really feels and how it really works. Because if I've never had that experience, I won't be able to help my students as much as possible. I need to understand how it feels.
Right, because it sounds like it makes sense in your head, but if you haven't experienced it, that's a completely different animal.
Yeah, it's like part of it feels like driving blind. Like I would have to trust it and just on trust alone, you know, and lacking experience. And I didn't like that. So I started it. And I liked most of what I was experiencing. And I did start finding some little gaps in things. So I think, as is probably clear to most by now, relying on comprehensible input alone without adequate or appropriate communication opportunities and without the opportunities for practicing output in a constructive way, or what I should say is actually practicing real output, because people will do a lot of things to practice parts of output, like just practicing pronunciation, for example, which is okay, but it's not the same.
Right.
But it did. It gave me the information I needed as a student of comprehensible input to understand and anticipate the needs of my students or the needs of anybody who's going to try to learn a language by that approach, or especially in the beginning by that approach.
Cool.
And I do feel that comprehensible input is something that is permanently a part of everyone's language learning journey, but especially in the beginning, it should be everything, just about. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm guessing with Japanese, you felt like you could understand a lot, which is great to start with, especially with a language like Japanese.
It took a long time.
Right. But then you got to a point in which you thought to yourself, but I'd like to start actually using the language, right? And you didn't get to do it in those classes, or...
Yeah, well, because I was learning Japanese completely on my own, that was the thing. And I really wanted to pressure test the idea of input is everything. You want better output, you need more input. And there is a lot of truth to that. But again, it's not the whole story. It's not the whole picture. So I acquired a lot of Japanese by watching. I think primarily starting with very easy videos is by far the best thing anybody can do. And then you can start trying to read little things, or you can start trying to listen to podcasts and integrating more and more of the different resources. But after, I think I did that for like 2 years on and off, I didn't have a super consistent schedule. It was something that happened in my free time because, with everything else going on in your life, sometimes we know as learners, it is hard to fit that in sometimes. So it depends how much priority you can give it. But eventually, my friends and I booked a group trip to Japan, and I thought, okay, I need to be ready now to at least use some of it. And so I scheduled, after about 2 years of self-study, I scheduled my very first tutoring session with a native speaker. And before that, I hadn't really had a single actual conversation in Japanese. I have a friend who speaks Japanese who I see not very often, and I would say a sentence or two to her once in a while to get some understanding. That's it. So realistically, I went about 2 years of input with no output or communicative practice, arguably no real communication.
Right.
And the crazy thing is that when I got to that session, I was able to operate 80 to 90% of that session just in Japanese. And I don't say that to make it sound like, I'm some genius or I'm super smart. Or no. I had so much, hundreds of hours of intaking Japanese. And as a teacher, I knew how to look for resources that were appropriate for my level.
Right.
I knew how to find the things that I needed because I've had practice finding those things, creating those things for my students in other languages. Right.
That's an art in itself.
Yeah. And that is a big tool that I got to use to help myself that not everybody has. I have that perspective. But I was able to, communicate with this person. It was an hour-long session. And the majority of that session, I was speaking Japanese, full of errors. Not every sentence was a total mess. Sometimes what I said made sense and it was fine, But when we talk about communication, the key piece is negotiating meaning. You have to negotiate. You have, if I say something that doesn't make perfect sense, that speaker might say something back to me to clarify. Oh, did you mean to say this? Did you mean to say that? Yes. Oh, right. That's what I wanted to say. We restate. Conversation continues. That is it.
Correcting without making it personal.
Yes. And it was correcting, to be specific, it was correcting not even so that I would fix the language, so that I could be understood. Right? The ultimate goal was still communication.
Yep.
And it worked. And I learned in that 1 hour, so many things that I was able to realize or started to make sense. And then when we got to Japan, just a week or two after that, I struggled sometimes. Sometimes I didn't. But the experiences I was able to have, because hopefully that's not too noisy. They're taking the trash out behind my house right now.
Can't hear anything, no worries.
That's great. But, the experiences I was able to have with native Japanese people, because I could talk even a little bit, changed their perception, changed my experience entirely.
Right.
And people were so kind. Some people didn't charge me for certain foods or drinks sometimes because I was the only person who was trying to speak Japanese in a situation. I didn't ask them for that,
Yeah.
They decided to do that. But that goes to show again that when you make an effort with a language and you focus on communicating, even if you make mistakes, it is a massive positive. It is so good.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, people appreciate it. Yep.
They really do. They really, really do. And that's what I try to tell folks too when they feel intimidated starting a language or are scared of speaking.
Yeah.
That's a normal response. You don't want to feel stupid. You don't want to feel like someone else thinks you're stupid. But I would say 99% of the time, they don't.
Yeah.
They don't. They're happy that you make an effort.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, and recently I started looking at it like an act of bravery.
Yeah.
No, I mean it because,
Right.
as you know, I live in Poland and I do speak the language, but the reason why I'm talking about output more often recently is because I feel like the gap is too large between how much I can understand, which is pretty much anything, to how much I can say.
Yeah.
It's like your case with Japanese. I can communicate, I can get my point across, but sometimes I feel like everything is simple. Like the way I say things is really simple.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
Right. Like, or if there's something deeper that I want to talk about, I struggle with it.
Mm-hmm.
And the other day I was actually walking down the street and a guy came up to me just to try to tell me about, I think it was Greenpeace or some like ONG or something. NGO, excuse me, in English.
Mm-hmm.
And he started speaking Polish. I understood everything he was saying, but I wanted to say something and I couldn't find the words at the time.
Right.
And right afterwards, I realized, like, oh my goodness. Like, I started thinking, what did he think of my Polish, things like that, which he probably didn't. But I realized that it's an act of bravery because I looked like a fool in front of someone, which, like you said, is totally fine.
Yeah.
But I think that's also one of the reasons why people appreciate it. Because you know that the person trying to learn your language is going to look like a fool many times. But despite that, they keep trying.
Yes.
Right? So I think that's why they appreciate it even more.
Mm-hmm.
So back to your experience with Japanese,
I agree that feeling is the same thing. It's really nice too when you meet someone in that target language or that target country, perhaps like I did, who is also trying to learn your language. So maybe both of you are not very good in the other language, but you're both trying, right? That's another exceptional experience because then you're both trying to be brave, right? And you both know that you're both trying to be brave and you understand each other. So you spend some of that conversation in one person's language and sometimes you switch to the other one for a little bit. You go back and forth.
Yeah.
But as
empathy is easier in that setting. Yeah.
Oh goodness, yes. And of course, as a language teacher, seeing your students go through that, having lived your own experiences of that, you are looking out for that, and you're always trying to encourage your students, not to worry about it. Some level of anxiety or fear towards it is normal, but you do. And I have told them in the past that, so you have to be brave. Stop worrying about what they think of you because more than likely they don't think anything bad, first of all. But stop worrying about it because if you make yourself anxious, chances are you might mess up a little bit more than if you were able to just say, it doesn't matter if I make mistakes. Some people, joke about, oh, well, when I drink a little bit, then my other language gets really, really good, right?
I was thinking exactly the same thing.
Right? And it's all because, well, all of a sudden, you're not really afraid. You feel right. You feel great about your language because you stop caring. You're like, it doesn't matter. And then they think, next day, I was really good at speaking Spanish last night, and now it's gone.
Right.
Like, well, no.
True.
It's still there.
And I was wondering about your Japanese experience in Japan. Like, I was almost waiting for a but from you, meaning that you were saying that I was able to communicate, to, Like, loved it, people appreciate it, but I was waiting for a but.
I think that the only but there was, I was ready for most daily life situations, at least a little bit, simple things, and beyond just being able to order food or ask where something is. That stuff is very simple. But then, if we went to a coffee shop, not only was I going to order and stuff, but then we would try to take time, or I would try to take time to speak with maybe the baristas who are working there. And I would chat with them a little bit about, what they're doing, maybe about the coffee that they're serving, stuff like that. And I was ready for most of that. And what I wasn't ready for was getting fitted for a kimono.
Okay.
So we ended up in this kimono shop, and this very elderly couple who was very kind. We had the experience there was wonderful, but they didn't speak any English, and they were trying to teach me the different parts of the kimono, how to put each part on, how to layer them, how to tie the sash that goes around your waist. They were trying to teach me all of the details of that in Japanese. I don't know any of that. I don't know that vocab. I don't know. I didn't practice anything like that. So all of a sudden, it felt like I had never studied Japanese before, right? Like all of a sudden, I know 0 words. And all I could say is, I don't understand, or thank you, or something like that. So that was my big but moment, where I felt completely helpless. But I didn't have, my whole time in Japan, I did not have a single experience where someone treated me negatively with any regards to me speaking Japanese. Not one. They were all positive, and usually in a profound way. Usually people would go out of their way to speak with me more, or to do something nice for me. Some people would give us like a trinket. Maybe it could have been like a sticker or something from their restaurant for us to take, because we shared this conversation. Or, following people on Instagram because you met and you like, hey, our conversation was good. Connections like that, very, very positive.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. I'm also curious. So then, when you got back from that trip, did you go on with your Japanese journey, or did you get back to it?
Yeah. I continue to this day, and thanks to that trip, I was able to buy an unhealthy amount of books in Japan and stuff them all into my suitcase. Right. My suitcase was not overweight, but it was very heavy. So I have plenty of manga. You're not going to be able to see them really back there on the shelf. Okay. This side, right.
I can see a Pokemon ball. That's all I can see. Nice.
Yeah, up there. Yeah. No, there's some manga down here. There's more back here. There's Jujutsu Kaisen. That's actually in Italian though. That one, a friend got that for me. So lots of reading materials. I'm very much still continuing my journey because I enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll make it back to Japan, someday for another long visit. And
cool.
Yeah.
And was that the moment you started thinking more about like the transition between input and output that we were talking about?
Yeah, that.
Yeah. No.
I was forced to think about that more with Japanese than ever before, because of the nature of me learning Japanese sort of as an experience, learning a language with no other knowledge. I couldn't do that with Italian because I already spoke Spanish and French. It's too similar. I got to skip so many steps automatically that it's not the same. So I needed a language that was completely different. And so it's the first time in my own learning that I was very forced, not just as a teacher, but in my own learning, that I was forced to think about How am I going to get from all this stuff I listen to and read and watch and can understand to getting those ideas across and being able to not, as you pointed out with your Polish, for example, to not just speak in extremely simple sentences forever. You know, I don't want that.
Exactly.
And the base answer to that, to the I guess the most important answer, or maybe 50-50, but the first answer to this question of getting to your output from all the input is first, it's more input, right? Because if let's take my experience at that kimono shop. If I do not know, if I've never seen or read or learned anything about kimonos and details about clothing or layers of clothing or specific parts or how to fold it or how to tie something, if I've never learned that in Japanese, I cannot talk about it because there's nothing in there, right? There's no words, there's no vocabulary. So how do you fix that? With input. I have to, so that next time I'm in that, say I want to buy another one next time I go, right? I need to, before that happens, watch some videos online where people in Japanese are talking about what a kimono is, maybe a little bit of the history on it, what the different pieces are called, how to wear it, how men wear it, how women wear it, and on and on and on, right? So the first step is always more input. That's why I take issue with programs, and there are so many companies or programs or applications that try to say, we will help you start speaking on day one of your French learning.
Yep.
Speak about what? If I have just learned my first 5 words in French today, then all we're going to speak about is bonjour, ça va, au revoir. That's it, right? What else are we going to do?
Good luck having a conversation with that, right?
Right. So we could say hello and goodbye back and forth for 20 minutes, right?
Right, yeah.
Like, it's not necessary.
Yeah.
So unless you are with a one-on-one teacher day one, you really don't have a reason to be speaking at all because you're not ready. There's nothing in there to pull from. If you're with a teacher or tutor, you can talk a little bit because they can scaffold it in the moment, right? By giving you an example sentence, or maybe they show you an example conversation, and then they ask you the same question, but in a very simple way. And so in a case like that, you could start speaking from your first lesson, but it will still be very, very little. Very little, right? So mostly you just don't need to. You need more input first so that you can talk about anything. The other piece is practicing active recall. And there's that sounds simple, but there's so much that goes into that. The skill of understanding input is completely separate from the skill of recalling the information and then producing it. It's completely separate. And so some people would suggest something like self-talk, talking to yourself in that language to force yourself to go and pull the information out. And I think there are good parts to that because that's something I did even with Spanish and French. I remember doing it a lot with French. I started learning French in college. I had part-time jobs outside of school. So I would go and I worked at a toy store at the time, actually. So I would, when we weren't busy or when I was just stocking shelves or cleaning up, I would go through the phrases that I had learned in the past week or two and just talk about myself or pretend I was asking somebody something or pretend I was having a conversation. It's helpful for practicing the recall. Although that, of course, is not actually communication.
Right. And sorry to interrupt, you did it out loud?
Sometimes, yeah.
Okay.
I would do it, I think most of the time I would do it out loud, just quiet enough for myself. I would do it out loud most of the time. Mentally, I think you can, but I think that's maybe even less helpful because you need to be forced to create it. There's a difference between me thinking about what I might want to say and me building it,
Yep.
So I think out loud, if you're going to do self-talk, out loud is the way to go, even if it's very quiet and, don't sit in a cafe for 30 minutes and do self-talk. People will be worried about you. But things like that are helpful. But a recall is only one part of it. The really tough part that I think is harder for people to talk about or address is, well, if I want either myself as a learner or I want my students to be able to output in more complex, more natural sounding ways, it's just the same 2 points. They need enough input to realize what sounds normal and what is a way to connect ideas like sentence connector, stuff like that. Not usually because you've told them what those are, but because they've seen them in context so many times that it's easier. I think it is worth stopping once in a while or giving structured input. If I need my student to know how to use a sentence with the word because, I like this because it has that, or any construct using a word such as because, then it's okay for the teacher to provide structured input to give them lots and lots, a high volume of examples on one topic, right? Because sometimes if you don't have that opportunity and you only see because once in a while you see it here and then, you read 2 more pages of your book and then you saw it one more time, it's not enough to stick. So structured input is good, but it comes a lot down to the input. And especially learning as an adult, we're smart enough to be able to analyze pieces like that, but we need to know that you cannot do that with everything because you cannot hold every separate variable in your brain at the same time. Imagine if us speaking our native language, imagine me speaking English, I have to think about every single word, if it's a noun, a verb, an adjective, an adverb, every single time I want to say any sentence, right? You can't do that.
No,
There's too many things you won't remember, you can't remember.
Yeah, I know.
So we can identify some of them explicitly, but some. And that's leveraging our intelligence and our maturity. But the rest has to be from communication, because we know that especially in our native languages, most people couldn't tell you probably almost any actual rule. You say, well, why do I have to say it that way? Why do I have to say the big red dog instead of the red big dog? Because to an English person, or to an English speaker, if I say I have a red big dog, they're gonna why do you say it like that? That's wrong. You can't say that. And if I say, why can't I say the red big dog? They're just gonna say, because it doesn't sound right.
Right.
That's the answer. It doesn't sound right.
Yep.
There is a rule that determines the order of adjectives in English. You cannot say red big dog. You have to say big red dog.
Yep.
Why? Because you do. Because that's how English speakers do it, right?
Yep.
But nobody thinks about that rule. Almost nobody consciously knows that rule. Very, very few people. Because they are actual language and grammar experts.
All right.
But that's a tiny, tiny fraction of the population of English speakers.
Yep.
And everybody else who needs English to communicate, you don't need to know that. You don't need to know it as if it's written down and you had to memorize it, And there are lots of things, even with Japanese, that I know that they're right because I've seen it the same way so many times. It just is.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there is a written version of that rule that tells me why it has to be that way, but I don't know it. Some of them I do.
Right. Actually, as you were speaking about the big red dog, I, as a non-native English speaker, I think it kind of rings a bell that we learned about that in school at some point.
Really?
But I obviously don't remember anything. Like, I remember there was a rule for the other adjective, like you said. But I have no idea what it was. But my point is, to me, if you say the red big dog, it also it doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
As a non-native speaker, that's what I mean, that you get to that point as well, just by input.
Because, yes, exactly. You've had so much of the correct examples that something that stands out like that is all of a sudden, without you realizing why? You think, there's something wrong there.
Correct.
Maybe I don't even know exactly what or why. I don't know the rule, but there's something wrong about that, and so that's the implicit knowledge. That's all the subconscious acquisition, because your brain is this incredible thing that takes care of so many things without you ever having to think about it. In language, just like with practically anything else, if I want to pick up my water bottle, I don't think about how each of my fingers separately closes, each one of them on this object, and then they have to stay closed. Yeah. And then I have to lift my arm and shoulder, automatic.
Yeah, it'd be crazy.
Done right. Nobody would function. Life would not function.
Exactly.
And so that's the power of the input. So let's talk specifically about improving output, right? Then what can we do to make output better? Well, number one is real communication. That's sort of the blanket answer. Because within real communication, you are forced to practice recall. You are forced to have pronunciation that is accurate enough that it's understandable.
Mm-hmm.
You are forced to be able to connect words and sentences at the correct speed. Because if I can only produce 2 words every 30 seconds, the other person is not going to have patience.
Yep.
Even a very patient person, they might say, oh, well, never mind. Or they might try to say the idea for me. I need the practice. And I'm not going to get better at that point by input alone. I need recall practice. I need pronunciation practice. I need that fluency practice of being forced in a situation to produce the words and the ideas right there for the means of communicating my need. Or even if it's in writing, it's the same thing. You just have more time.
More time.
But you don't technically have unlimited time. I remember finishing my semester in France when I was studying in France and having written exams at the end of the semester.
Right.
And I had the same classes as French students. And so when we were given 2 or 3 hours to write a whole thesis on a book or something, or on an author, that's not unlimited time. All of a sudden, that feels like 5 minutes,
Right.
Especially as a foreigner, you're like, oh my God, I'm trying to... And here's...
Yeah, I'm thinking even if you're doing it by yourself at home, you can force it so you can avoid thinking about it forever. Meaning that you can time yourself and try to, I don't know, I'm just thinking about it. Like,
yes,
you can write things down for 10 minutes, like as much as you can. Then the next day, as much as I can, plus a little more. That way you don't fall into the trap of thinking about it forever.
Yes.
Right?
So there are great things like that to do on your own, but I hope everyone understands that those are not permanent solutions to improving the output. They're a step, because if I practice, let's say I pick a topic and I say, okay, I'm going to talk to myself about my food preferences in Japanese for 3 minutes. I'm going to time myself. I might even record myself. Doesn't matter. I'm going to talk about my food preferences for 3 minutes straight. That will help me practice recall. It will help me practice some form of speed and fluency, knowing that I'm trying to fill the time without giant gaps. But it's still not communication. So it's a part way. It's helping practice some of the skills that build into communication, but it doesn't reach the last step because I don't have an audience, right? If at least I was recording or maybe writing a message to a native speaker, well, now it is communication. And I could do all the same steps, but then I'm sending it. And that's the thing about, especially in a classroom, actual communication-based activities, or just task-based or communication-based communicative learning, different labels for this, versus just a regular language practice activity, right? I could have a story about a guy, he goes to the zoo and he looks at 5 different animals that day. And then the question might say, does he go to the zoo? Yes. That's not communication. It's identification. And what is the purpose of that activity other than to practice language? There is no purpose. Nobody's actually learning something new, like about their classmate or about the world. Yeah. No one's building a relationship. It has to have a real purpose. So 100%, you can practice recall using something like self-talk, using journaling. Yep. And that's recall, but also helps process what's happened. So something that I use with students a lot in my private tutoring sessions is we often read books together. So I may have a student write a summary. I'll give them a time to write. You have 5 minutes. Write me a short summary of the chapter we read for this week's lesson. And they write for 5 minutes. And I don't make them do that to say, okay, next activity. They are doing that for the purpose of recalling what happened because they read it in that target language. Now they have to process it in that target language, and they have to output in that target language. And they're doing it for the purpose of me reading over it to, one, check their understanding, but then for us to go right into a discussion. And sometimes that discussion is because maybe they missed a very important event or detail in the chapter that's crucial to the story. They have to know it. That happens. Or maybe they got everything. Okay, then we don't need to use it for the events now. Now we can talk about thoughts, opinions, predictions about the story. So we have a purpose. We have multiple purposes for that.
Yep.
But that's communication with, they could have written the summary on their own if they wanted, without me even ever seeing it. If they wanted to practice trying to recall and forcing themselves to process, it's still helpful. But then nobody's there to help give them feedback on that writing.
Right.
And if all you ever do, and I actually am talking about this in a video that I should have coming out later this week. If all you ever do is self-talk, for example, or journal entries, but no other speaker ever sees them or is able to give you feedback, you might accidentally form very bad habits or incorrect language and then make it permanent.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I just was going to say that I look at self-talk, for example, as like a stepping stone to sort of mitigate the fear of going out to the real world right away, right? Because that is, you go from yes input to the real world. It's shocking. It's because it's like from zero stress to 100, right?
Yes.
So things like that, you start the process of output
Mm-hmm.
without the extreme pressure of
Yes.
having to communicate with a native speaker. And,
Yeah. It is. I agree 100% because then you've primed your brain on a topic. That also helps you notice when you have knowledge gaps. Let's say I knew tomorrow I'm going to meet up with my friend at a restaurant who's a Japanese speaker, and I know I'm going to want to talk about the food. So I practiced today talking about food on my own, and I realized I don't know how to say shrimp.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to a seafood restaurant. I don't know how to say shrimp, and I don't know how to say salmon. Or I don't know how to say sear or boil or whatever food, then I can have that realization on my own, right, without the pressure. And I can even go look those things up then too, and then try to repurpose them. If you're an intermediate or advanced learner already, that's pretty accessible because you already have a better idea of what sounds correct and what sounds like it's not going to make sense. And you might not be 100% right, but you'll be probably really close. And then you can use it later. So there's a method I actually use with some of my students on this very point. Now, you can use it as an individual, sort of as self-taught, or you can use it in a class, like with a teacher or in a tutoring session. And I don't remember what she called it. So this is from Judith Tiral. Maybe you've heard of her. She's a Spanish YouTuber.
Okay.
And she makes excellent videos, but I love listening to her. Anyways, but she was trying to improve her French, I think, for a video she was making. And she said, okay, I made a list of all these topics from the easiest topic for me to the hardest topic and try to force herself to talk about each of them for a couple minutes without looking up anything, no resources, just there it is, set a timer, 2 minutes, talk.
Those were topics that she thought she was going to use later.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yes. And so they were all pretty common things like sports, travel, food, whatever.
Yep.
And then all the way down to things like government or philosophy. That's up to the learner as far as what your goals are and what you need to know. But it was exactly that. She was anticipating and discovering, I don't know, this or that I need to know for a successful communication or conversation on that topic. And so, as you said, I think it's an excellent stepping stone to be ready for that, as long as you do at some point have the real conversation, have the real opportunity. Yep.
I think, is that the concept of language islands?
I'm not so familiar with the term.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also was going to say that, we can leave the link to her video later. And of course, your channel.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about it yet.
Yeah.
But I'll leave links to, like your channel. And
yeah, absolutely.
You talk about language learning, but you also use games and things like that to teach English, French, and Spanish.
Yeah, so that all started while I was still in the classroom, and it may have started during the pandemic, but I think I actually made the first French Minecraft video before that, perhaps. Okay. Because, I knew that I was required to cover certain topics or themes as units in the classroom, and there are ways to make that entertaining or fun or engaging for your students. But I saw this as an easy way because for the age group, because the students I taught were between 11 to 14 years old. They all know, what Minecraft is. And a lot of them play it all the time. So it was easy to do that and make something that they could connect with. And they already knew most of the concepts. So they're not trying to learn something brand new they've never heard of. They're just attaching new language, new sounds to meaning that they already have. Okay. And we know that these form and meaning or sound meaning connections are everything in language. So they've already got the meaning. Now we're just going to say, well, instead of looking at the Minecraft villager house as a house, now it's a maison, and we just start connecting little things like that. And I made that video and the students loved it. It was so much fun. It was something simple that I did and they enjoyed it so much that I ended up making more of that type of content. I also made things like French cooking videos where I would make, something very, very simple. Like I made cookies, in my kitchen, but we did it in French and then watch that in class during our unit. That's all about food because these things, whether it's a game or something else like that, it's another way to interact. But I think more importantly, it's a way to take the focus off of whether or not, as a student, do I feel like I am just stressed about the correctness of my language? Am I just stressed about my language all the time?
Yep.
We need a context where you are not stressed and where you kind of forget that what you're doing is in that other language.
Yep.
Because you're focused on the means of the entertainment, or you're focused on learning something, and then you can relax and you can take in the language without thinking about it or trying to say, oh, in the intro of the video, he used this verb. How was that verb conjugated? What? You don't worry,
Think about it. Yeah. Just want to know what happens in the game.
Yes.
It reminds me of my journey with English when I started watching the NBA in English. Because I already knew the game. I already liked basketball.
Right.
And I had enough knowledge from school to be able to understand what they were talking about. Plus, there's a good thing about sports that you got the commentators and you see the action at the same time, which is great. Just like video games.
Yeah.
But I obviously had the hope that it was going to help me out. But I wasn't doing it because of the language for the most part. I just wanted to watch the game.
Yes.
And all those other little things, like I said, that sports are great because of that. And I already knew the game, so I was familiar. It was just, like you said, like new words, new sounds to mean, to things that I already was familiar with.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah.
And that carries perfectly to the classroom, because when something is truly communicative, it's that language itself is not the purpose of an activity. Language is the communication, it's the means, it's the method that you're accessing the real purpose. So in the beginning of the school year, if my purpose is to learn about my students, then I'm not making it purposely difficult on them to have perfect sentences, or I'm not making the focus, did you write, il s'appelle instead of elle s'appelle for the right person that you were talking about? And sometimes you scaffold, and, depending on level, maybe you don't need to. But the focus is on the information. And then you get them to sort of forget that they are actually very much actively learning something.
Right.
Because they're using it the way they would use their own language now. Yeah. And for all the teachers out there that maybe feel intimidated by changing to something like communicative approach, I cannot stress enough the positive feedback that I get, or that I got from students when we did things like that. Yeah. Students who I had who did not want to participate, did not want to speak in most activities when it was language focused. Yeah. When I switched to communicative activities, these students suddenly were the most invested, excited people in the room. Yeah. Literally had a girl who really didn't do that great in school in general, but she was very kind and she always tried. And we switched to a lot of communicative tasks that year. And she would come to me after them and be like, can we do more of this? I love this. I want to do more of these activities. So I'm like, this is real. The positive impact and the difference it makes for these learners is very real because it's not just another school subject. It's an experience, right? And it's self-expression. It's discovering others. It's building social connections. Those are real purposes.
Right. Yeah. In the Minecraft example, all of a sudden that student gets to talk about a game he or she's playing all day long.
Yeah.
And like, oh wow, this was French, like.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially with younger students, or I would argue in the USA, students pretty much until they're maybe through college even. Some people, the USA, unfortunately, people have a problem looking outside into the world. But a lot of people think of a language as such a limited set of things. Like, I thought in French, you just sound fancy and eat expensive food and snails and croissants. Right. And then what do you mean there are real French YouTubers making vlogs about soccer? And all of a sudden that kid who thought, I don't care at all about French, I'm just taking this stupid class to fill a requirement, but they love soccer, they go, oh my gosh, they talk about other stuff.
Yep.
And there are people in that language that love what I love. And I think especially Americans have that issue where they kind of forget that everything else is going on in all different languages all over the world all the time.
Right.
And so, yeah, they need to be drawn out into that mindset of like, oh, I get it. It's not just, French isn't just this silly, funny language that, 10 people use on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
There's, it, just like all other languages, has a whole life and culture and background, history, involvement, everything.
Cool.
Right.
Good point. Okay, there's a couple more things that I want to talk about before we wrap it up. One, because I forgot to ask you before, when you were talking about the reading activity with your kids, and you were talking about feedback. So how do you go about it? If they do make a mistake, do you reformulate it correctly, like we mentioned before?
Which reading activity was I talking about?
You were talking about reading a chapter with them.
Oh, yeah.
I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. So there.
Oh, wait, no, excuse me. You were talking about them writing the summary of the chapter. Yeah.
Right. So, yes, that feedback. Yeah. I think feedback is very level dependent. And the more beginner a student is, I would say the less feedback almost that they get.
Right.
You have to focus. Did they communicate the most important meaning or the most important detail? So I would never ask a first semester Spanish student to write a summary of a chapter anyway, because that's too daunting.
True.
It's too difficult. But if I had them do, maybe not a chapter, maybe they read a paragraph, and I just said, okay, flip the page over, don't look at it, write a little bit in Spanish about what you read about. Even if it's just a word, or, if a big tree was part of the story and you can't say, well, there is a big tree called this and it's important because, maybe they just write big tree.
Yep.
If they're able to do that, then they've seen that in the story and they processed it for meaning, and now they're producing it. So for those level of students, very minimal feedback, if at all, just to clarify the ends of communication. I don't know. Let's say they were trying to write gran árbol, and they, I don't know, leave off a letter and just write gra árbol. Okay, well, the only feedback they're going to get is clarification. Oh, did you mean gran?
Okay.
Okay, right? But with the people that I tutor, one-on-one, a lot of them are much higher level. They're upper intermediate students, so they're advanced level students. And so they are, we're reading full chapter books. And a lot of those would be young adult novels, so for people roughly 13 to 17, 18, whatever. So those novels are usually a little easier, than an adult novel. Like
Yep.
reading that is easier than reading Game of Thrones or something, So they're capable of reading that with enough understanding to process the story, make meaning out of it, understand the narrative. They will lose details. They will miss things. They will misunderstand sometimes. So as far as the feedback goes, on the writing itself, for those students, I do give feedback, but usually I try to target it and reconnect it to something in the book. So if they're telling me, the main character, they want to say the main character discovered a secret garden or something. This happened in a book that I'm thinking about with a student recently.
Okay.
And maybe they don't know how to say the past tense there. They say he discovers. But I know that they know past tense because they've used it before, or they use it regularly, but not without errors.
Okay.
So maybe we take a moment to not just correct the phrase, but now let's build additional examples. Well, you said in the summary, he discovered, so we'll rewrite it maybe first to, instead of he discovers, we write he discovered a secret garden. So to reinforce that point in that moment, we could say, what else did he discover? He also discovered, or he discovered an abbey. He discovered a cave. He discovered a lost key, right? And it could be, depends if I need to just focus on that word discovered, or if I just need to focus on, in French, for example, the passé composé, and it's not just about the participle, but it's about the whole forming of the past. So then we can focus on still communicating the narrative of the book. That's the purpose. But we're going to highlight that passé composé, that past tense form, over and over and over within the very context of that chapter, right? Then our purpose is still mutual understanding of the story, negotiating the meaning of our understanding of the story, in prep still for the following discussion we're about to have. There is a real purpose, and now the focus on form is not the end of the discussion, right? It's part of it. Then when we're finished reviewing that, and we're finished reading through the rest of the summary, then we move on to the reason for the summary. Okay, was everything understood from the chapter? Yes, great. Let's talk about how you felt about that. What was exciting? Because here's what I thought was exciting, or I think this is going to happen next. Do you agree with me? Do you not agree? And go on and on and on as much as you need.
Great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gotta keep, the purpose is everything. The purpose of actually using it for something, that's everything. I can't say, hi student, welcome back. I saw you messed up a past tense verb in your summary. So now we're going to do verb charts for 15 minutes. Wrong answer. That's not it.
Yeah. No, I like that. Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. And then, final thing, I know that you have a final message for people who think that they're not talented for languages, or that
yes,
they're never gonna make it, or that the other people can, but they can't.
Right. Absolutely. So I'll say two very important things. First of all, anybody who already speaks a language can learn a new one. So this goes especially for people who have been through a traditional classroom experience, a strictly grammar or grammar translation-based classroom experience. You were forced through a system of something where you were promised, to be able to speak some of a language or communicate in a language, and then you did not practice any of that. What you learned was grammar, something highly specific that most people don't even know about their own language, that is not even necessary for communication. So don't be fooled by a bad classroom experience or by a misguided one that you are incapable. That is simply not true. And I think this goes especially for people my age and older who have been through those experiences, because, I myself went through that and didn't realize the truth of language and the true feelings of communication until I had my experiences studying overseas, right? So anybody can. And if you are somebody who has already taken a course and you said, no, I tried it once, I'm not built for languages, or I simply can't do that, it's not true. You just need a context where communication is the actual focus and is the actual goal, unless for some reason you need to know the grammar to become a language expert. But again, that is not most people.
Yep.
by a lot. So you've got to find the things that you enjoy in that language. You still have to have a diversity. You can't only just talk about, going to Italy and eating pasta. To oversimplify, I can't only learn that. I do have to learn how to say other things along the way, but you can let your interests guide you. And especially as a beginner, that gives you more reasons to want to do it. So anybody could do it. Anybody can learn a language. If you already speak a language, you can learn a new one. Doesn't matter what experience you had in the past, and it doesn't matter how old you are either. You can. You just have to treat it like it is. You have to treat it as, I'm learning this to communicate, not, for some reason, I now need to learn the labels of all the different verb tenses in a new language when I don't even know the correct labels in my own language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Language is a living thing. You have to treat it as such. It's not a school subject.
No. Yeah, sometimes because they know I'm a teacher, sometimes people ask me about, not my students, because they already know what I think about it, but
yeah,
people ask me about specific verb tense in Spanish, and I'm like, which one is that? Like,
yeah.
Pretérito, imperfecto, whatever.
Yeah.
Which one is that?
Yeah. Let me think about this, because you as a native Spanish speaker, you don't have a verb chart in your brain, whereas so many of us have just had it forced into us so many times. Like,
and the conjugations
right. If I need to make a verb chart right now for tener, like, yeah, I can do it. Did I want to have that, burned into my brain for my entire life? Maybe not, but it's there now.
A good idea for a tattoo. I'm just thinking about it now.
Right, just right here. Ir, yeah, just do like, I don't know, ir, tener, estar, ser. Those would be good ones, right?
Yeah, just get the reverse so you can see it in front of a mirror.
In the mirror.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Just like Prison Break, but for language.
That's right. Cover me in verb chart tattoos, please.
Yeah. All right. So, well, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Carp. Thank you so much.
Yes.
I've learned a lot.
Yeah, I'm glad. And my goal is always to inspire and empower people. And I guess if I had to close on any other message, it's please stop getting tricked by clickbait things you see on YouTube or anywhere else on the internet, where especially ads for companies that have things to sell you. I mean, I've only done one video where I reviewed an advertisement from an app, but I have seen so many ridiculous ones, and sometimes I want to make more of them. I saw one that literally said, you will learn 1,000 words every 2 days, I think. That is like so beyond stupid. It's not happening. Please, especially when people have something to sell you and they make you some claim that is too good to be true, it is too good to be true. It's not real. Language is a long-term thing, and it's not always super difficult. It's not always some crazy struggle. It is enjoyable. but you have to realize that it's long term. Nobody has a magic potion.
Yep.
No, but we can't put a chip in your brain, not yet. That just is downloading French, downloading German. Not yet, man. Not for a long time.
Yeah, as you said at the beginning, when they talk about speaking from day one, they know that's what most people want.
We want communication.
That's the pain point, right?
Yep. And then they'll make you a promise like, our AI tutor that you have to pay, $60 a month for, our AI tutor is just like having a professional tutor with you 24/7. No, it's not. It's not. AI is not good enough for that yet. Trust me. Just trust any language teacher. AI is not good enough for that yet. They're still making really dumb mistakes. Yeah. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Same here. And like I said, I'll leave the links to your channel and anything that you want me to link to.
Yes. Yeah. Awesome.
And yeah, well, see you soon.
Yes. Until next time.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
Thanks so much for watching this interview. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was helpful for you. And if you want to know more about language learning, language acquisition, like, what's the best way to learn a language, ideas for language learning, the best resources at different levels. Here, you can find the whole playlist with all the interviews I've done so far with different researchers, teachers, polyglots, and so on. And finally, right here, you smash this guy right in the face to subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.